Castlevania as video games go back to the NES era of 8-bit gaming as a gothic horror hardcore platformer series, which indeed was very popular back then. But what really elevated the series to new heights and established a whole new genre of sorts, together with the Metroid Series of Nintendo of course, was when Symphony of the Night completely changed what a Castlevania game can be in 1997. And at the same time led to the Vania part of the today very popular genre of Metroidvania that brought us gems like Ori and the Blind Forest, Hollow Knight, Blasphemous, and even games like the Souls series. Since the series is getting more and more popular thanks to the Netflix show, I want to talk about the 2D Metroidvania titles in the series, which are one of my favorite games ever. But before that, I want to show you how the series evolved over the years and talk about it in general a bit. Since the release of the before mentioned Symphony of the Night, the Metroidvania games nearly completely took over the Castlevania game releases until the reboot with Lords of Shadow in 2010. While there were other home console releases like Lament of Innocence, which fleshed out the origins of the series staples like Death and Dracula and the Belmont clan, the Metroidvanias were the overall more successful games, and thus defined the series. The man who is considered father of that part of the series was Koji Igarashi, who acted as a producer for nearly every Castlevania game in the 2000s. He brought us every of the 6 handheld Metroidvania games that defined my childhood a lot, but just like with one of Konami's other masterminds, Hideo Kojima, they at one point decided to flush him down the toilet. Since then he created his own game studio and even released a highly Castlevania inspired game with Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. Since the shift of the 2010s, Konami seems to more and more retire as a serious game producing company and instead focuses on, well, different things. While trying to milk out every inch of the series they still own for a cheap cash grab. But recent rumors and activity suggests that other companies are on their way of buying these franchises off of them, which would be a sake since everything is better than nothing happening with them at all. While Castlevania is pretty much non-existent outside of the definitely outstanding Netflix series since Lords of Shadow 2 today, there was a time where games were released nearly every year. These hentai titles of the Metroidvania genre that I mentioned before defined my love for that genre and are played by me nearly every year up until now. And since my love for the now somehow dead game franchise was brought up to life again and maybe even increased by the Netflix series, I figured it'd be time to make a video where I talk about every single Metroidvania Castlevania game released with some extras. While I really like the 2 home console Lords of Shadow entries in the series, and them being actually the only Castlevania games I played that aren't Metroidvania, they won't be mentioned here. They are pretty solid action games with great voice acting and music, but differ a lot from the Castlevania core and tone. Lords of Shadow 2 actually tried to implement the Metroidvania gameplay into a semi-3D open world, which I'd like to see more of in a possible third entry, but poor sales and an effed up storyline led to the reboot series being completely scrapped after its release. But if you enjoy 3D games and the Castlevania entries I talk about in this video, I still highly advise you to play this game though. It still looks, sounds and plays really nicely and offers in my opinion a solid take on 3D Metroidvania. I just wanted to get that off my chest before I start the list, because the reason for them not appearing in it isn't that I don't enjoy them, but because they can't really be compared to the rest. The same goes for the 2D classic platformer games like Rondo of Blood, as well as all the other 3D games and spin-offs. I can't really compare them or even judge if they are any good, because I didn't play any of them, because I'm not the biggest platformer guy, let alone frustrating ones like those games or Cuphead, Ghosts and Goblins and the like. Nowadays there are sadly no new game releases for Castlevania anymore, and fans just already shift their view on other studios, more often indie, like Igarashi's 505 games. But in my opinion that has nothing to do with Castlevania's quality, but rather Konami's way of handling their franchises in general in the past 5 to 10 years. I'm just glad that there are two handful of very awesome titles released in the high of the series in the 2000s, so that I can now rank them and show you what are the best ones. My 10th place sadly has to kick off the list as the only game in the ranking I really dislike, Castlevania Circle of the Moon. While it's still regarded as a solid entry in the franchise by many fans, I couldn't bring myself to finishing this in 2001 released GBA launch title. Every time I tried to play the game, something fell off, but now due to my research, I realized that this may come down to the fact that it's the only handheld Metroidvania Castlevania in the GBA and NES era not actually made by Igarashi, which you can notice very quickly. Character sprites look very dull and they fail to adapt Symphony of the Night's graphics on a handheld, only with this title. Other than that, the game lacks the RPG complexity of Symphony of the Night or games like Aria of Sorrow. Movement feels slow and stiff with running requiring double pressing of the forward button, which is a horrible idea for an exploration-based Castlevania game. In addition, I felt like the game lacks good save point placement, but most importantly, the story feels so uninspired. Granted, Castlevania stories are never of big complexity, but this one is especially boring. The main villain in this game is Carmilla, and we play as Nathan Graves, who doesn't wield the vampire killer, but the hunter whip instead. Why they chose to not have a Belmont play the main role in this game is not clear to me at all. Having someone else wield a weapon very similar to the vampire killer, trying to kill Dracula just makes the game seem like a bootleg, while being actually an official title. The sound effect and music quality is quite bad even for a GBA game, but that is fully understandable due to the fact that Circle of the Moon is a launch title. The only real positive thing I have to say is that the card system is quite unique and pretty cool actually. Other than that, Circle of the Moon is, in my opinion, the worst Castlevania Metroidvania. Place 9 is also taken by a GBA title, Circle of the Moon's follow-up Harmony of Dissonance. But let me tell you this immediately, I really like Harmony of Dissonance. But its low placement comes down to the fact that it is still flawed enough to not be as good as any of the following places, because they are nearly all of the same quality. In this title we play as Juste Belmont, and yeah, this is how I would spell him. I'm really confused on what's his official name, but everyone seems to go by their own interpretation anyways, so... Simon Belmont's grandson, who tries to find his friend Liddy in Dracula's repaired castle 44 years after Simon defeated the Dark Lord. He wanders through the two different castles, meeting two different versions of his friend Maxine, who Dracula tries to use as his vessel. First off, the game really improves on Circle of the Moon's moving stiffness by granting Juste a forward sprint that has no delay in addition to the serious staple backslide. That makes Harmony of Dissonance actually the most fast-paced game in the franchise, at least until you get certain speed abilities in the games like Dawn of Sorrow or Order of Ecclesia. The game looks very nice for a GBA game and really converts Symphony of the Night's style and sprites into the handheld system, in comparison to Circle of the Moon. Besides that, Harmony of Dissonance improves on Symphony of the Night's lack of a proper magic system, but still isn't as complex as Aria of Sorrow or that of Ecclesia, for example. The game's sub-weapon and magic system offers cool combinations and inspires for some experimentation. Noticeably as well is the fact that it implemented teleport points properly for the first time with choosable targets. But the game has two very major flaws. For once, the soundtrack quality is utter agony even for GBA standards, and much worse than anything else on the system. For some reason they decided to pull in all the music memory space into the title theme and the ending, which left the main game with the worst examples of GBA sound font tracks. The other big flaw is the confusing castle mapping. While each individual castle map is pretty solid in structure, the confusement comes from the realization in which castle you are at which point and how the map overlaps. Another small issue for me is that the game only has the vampire killer, same as Circle of the Moon, as the only weapon, instead of the multiple weapon system from subsequent entries and Symphony of the Night. But it makes that off with the customization options for the whip, in some degree at least. Harmony of Dissonance is a solid entry in the series that deserves at least one playthrough by every fan, but maybe you should turn the music just a bit quieter than usual. Before I start talking about my ranking number 8, Bloodstained Ritual of the Night, let me explain why an obviously not Castlevania title is actually on this list. As I mentioned before in the intro section, Castlevania is pretty much dead at this point. And with the heart and soul of the Metroidvania series Koji Igarashi gone from Konami and with his own studio and Castlevania inspired games, it's quite obvious that his Bloodstained series takes the place of his old work. And besides the new 3D art style, the game plays, sounds and looks exactly like any other official game in the Castlevania series made by him. This is why Bloodstained definitely belongs on this list. Instead of a vampire hunter in this game, you play as Miriam, a shardbinder trying to free humanity from demon forces emerging from a dark multi-layered castle. Sound familiar? Well, the game definitely puts its finger on the fact that it really wants to be Castlevania without any of its copyright characters and lore. But as well as with the Castlevania series, story is just incidental. The character design is great and goes back or maybe even improves on Castlevania's gothic roots. Ritual of the Night's content amount is huge, as well as the customization options and possibilities of Miriam's looks. Even the game's enemies just feel like the familiar enemies from the handheld Castlevania games, which invokes a feeling of sanctuary even in this dark castle. Speaking of the castle, the layout is very solid and it's designed well, but maybe a bit unmemorable at times. But exploration is very rewarding. Its main gimmick, the shard binding, feels very similar to Aria of Sorrow or Dawn of Sorrow Soul system, and it's even as versatile as with many different abilities. But unfortunately, I have quite a lot of critique points for the game. My major problem is its unrefined 3D art style, which isn't nearly as beautiful as the Castlevania series' usual pixel art style. They could have easily made the game in that style and thus make it look much more solid, and could have focused on other aspects instead of trying to forcefully create the game in 3D graphics that look not polished at all. Other than that, later portions of the map are poor in level design and feel rushed. Animations more often look clunky and crafting feels meaningless and unexplained. But that is sadly not where issues end for me. The hub feels meaningless as well, in opposite with the one from Aria of Ecclesia, for example, and the quests the side characters give you are the most boring ones of all the games on the list. The word boring sadly accounts to any other side character not being found in the hub as well. They are uninspired and lifeless. The whole plot and most importantly castle design feels like a 20-year later poor knockoff of Symphony of the Nights, rather than a slight evolution of the formula that every handheld Castlevania game offered after Symphony of the Night. While being a very much enjoyable Metroidvania and definitely worth a play if you are a fan of Igarashi's Castlevania games, I can only really recommend the game for someone who still wants more of the same after finishing every other game on the list. Besides Circle of the Moon maybe, to be honest. The game somehow misses the charm of Igarashi's older games and is somewhat unrefined while still being fun to play. With place number 7, Aria of Sorrow, we will finally wrap up the whole GBA Castlevania line of games. This game and its sequel may have the most outstanding setting of all Castlevania games. You play as Summer Cruz, a high school student who gets warped into Dracula's castle. Sounds pretty normal for Castlevania? Well, the game takes place in 2035, so we are talking future here. And Dracula's castle for some reason is locked in an eclipse. But the out of ordinary doesn't stop here. Soma is no descendant of the Belmont clan, but a reincarnation of Dracula and thus can control the souls of the castle's various monsters. All that makes up for the most unique setting and magic system in the series. The soul mechanic is great and offers very versatile playstyles, by having each player probably obtain very different souls on their playthroughs, besides the mandatory ones that are required for the usual Metroidvania exploration, like double jumping for example. Other than that, the art style is beautiful, and despite the modern setting, it still looks very much gothic. Worthy of a mention is the fact that Aria of Sorrow was the first game in the series to introduce a various amount of weapon types, like broadswords, axes, hammers, katanas, spears, and the like. Also, the game does not contain a rehash of the castle like Harmony of Dissonance or Symphony of the Night, which keeps it fresh, though a bit short. But as great as the game sounds so far, I still have some points of critique though. While being very well composed, the music still lacks the quality of the DS titles or the home console games on the list, because obviously of the GBA sound chip. The same goes for the graphics. While being good for the GBA itself, they are obviously not as good looking as the DS titles or Symphony of the Night, though there are some few critique points outside of hardware limitation. There are weapons and gear that are way too universally the best and much too easy to obtain, which makes the end boss fight and Graham especially a joke. Other than that, some parts of the game feel way too easy and other way too difficult, and some areas lack a level design a bit like the Hanging Gardens. But all of that is pretty much nitpicking. If you're looking for an entry point to the series, Aria of Sorrow might be the way to go actually, because there are no real major flaws. But for me, all the DS successors improve on its very solid core, and they are better looking and sounding obviously, which is maybe the only reason that it's that low on the list. Because Aria of Sorrow might be one of the best GBA games ever. For everyone who thought that the next game would have been on one of the highest spots, I sadly have to disappoint you. The game that started the whole subgenre in the Castlevania series, Symphony of the Night, didn't even make the top 5. But don't worry, with its 6th place it's still pretty high on the list for a game I didn't even like the first time I played it. But since then I replayed this fan favorite multiple times and I really grew on it. But in my opinion it still has major flaws, which is not surprising because it was the first of the Metroidvania titles released. For the first time really at its release, you wouldn't play as one of the muscular whip-swimming Belmonts, but as Dracula's son Alucard, who is exploring his father's castle searching for the last member of the clan who defeated the Dark Lord named Richter. Alucard's adventure is accompanied by beautiful music of maybe the most versatile soundtrack of the whole series. No song sounds similar, and because this game is the only of the 2D Metroidvania Castlevania games that are released on a home console, the audio quality is outstanding. That is also the reason the graphics are as good as they are. while most of the game uses pixel art that looks very similar to the DS titles, the 3D backgrounds and assets that are used are the best looking in the series. In advance, Symphony of the Night is the only game of the pixel art Metroidvanias to offer fully voiced dialogue. Granted, it's pretty funny from today's standpoint, but it has its charm. But Symphony of the Night also has some great unique things gameplay wise as well. Alucard's abilities are very unique, but what really sets them apart from many abilities of the other games is the fact that the Cloud, Wolf or Bat can be used not just in designated areas, but on multiple occasions. Other than that, shields are an interesting mechanic I actually like to return, which sadly never happened. Symphony of the Night's areas are well done and their level design holds up to this day. Having familiars accompany you all the time for no mana cost is pretty nice as well. But as I already hinted, the fact that Symphony of the Night is the first of its kind brings with it that many mechanics later games established are missing, such as choosable teleporting locations or direct item use from the menu. Talking about items, the menu is very confusing with items like weapons, consumables, and even one-off items being in one section. Furthermore, Alucard only uses 2 different kind of weapon types in this game, instead of very different ones implemented in the later games like greatswords, axes, lances. In addition, Symphony of the Night lacks a solid magic or sub-weapon system, with only one sub-weapon at a time that you can't even hold on to, and only a handful of spells that require complicated inputs. Lastly, the inverted castle is a nice surprise, but it's literally just a reuse of the same map, with cheap difficulty spikes and only 3 different music tracks for all its areas. But all in all, Symphony of the Night is still a good entry in the series, but in my opinion, more of an unrefined basis for many of the later games. After we had a game set in the past previously, we now return to the sorrow of the future with number 5, Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow. This is the only direct sequel story-wise of the Metroidvania games in which we take on the role of Summer Cruz again. After Soma seed away chaos for good in Aria of Sorrow, everyone assumed Dracula's cycle of revival is finally over. But when members of a cult appear before Soma, his powers awaken again. So, he and other familiar faces like Yoko Bernades, Julius Belmont, Arikado, alias Alucard, and Hammer follow their trace to their cold castle in Europe that is infested with monsters just like Dracula's. Why can these random people summon a whole castle full of demons as the Dark Lord only could before? I have no idea. But it's great to return to the unique setting because it means that the soul system is back. But not only that, Dawn of Sorrow has in my opinion the best completely connected castle map. It's huge and offers very many shortcuts and ways to connect all the many areas. In addition, the graphics got a major upgrade from Aria of Sorrow, and areas are looking even more unique and detailed, and are very distinguished from each other. It's also the game with the most gameplay value because, again, each enemy has 3 different item drops and souls to get. With the soul mechanic returning, this game has the best magic mechanic as already said with Aria of Sorrow, but Dawn of Sorrow even improved on it. You can now have up to 3 sets of soul combinations you can switch to on the fly, which gives the game its own unique flow. Another addition is the new soul weapon transformation. Rather than simply finding the best weapons somewhere easily, most of the weapons have to be crafted by combining them with souls. This offers additional motivation to farm souls and makes some of them that are not very useful as abilities worthwhile actually. Also, Julia's mode is back as the afterstory second play mode, but Dawn of Sorrow does one thing that puts this above every other of those modes of the other Metroidvanias. Rather than only playing Julius, this time Yoko and Alucard join our party, which we can switch to at any time. This is not only an homage to Castlevania 3, but makes the mode infinitely more enjoyable because every one of the three plays very differently. And it's actually the first time you can play Alucard again since Symphony of the Night in a 2D Metroidvania game. This mode is so good that it's the only one of its kind that I finished to the end. But sadly, as a title being released in the early days of the DS life cycle, it brings with it some downsides, for example in form of terrible touch control gimmicks. Bosses can only be defeated by drawing circles on the touchscreen after you landed the final hit, which makes them a chore to go through if you mess up. Other than that, my complaints are pretty small actually. The story is pretty boring since it lacks the unique aspect of its predecessor now, since the mystery is gone and many plot points are rehashed. Other than that, Dawn of Sorrow was actually the first game on the handhelds to have this really boring and lifeless anime art style, instead of the series' staple gothic look. What I thought to be Konami's decision to attract even more young gamers because Castlevania was slowly drifting into handheld mainstream thanks to Aria of Sorrow, was instead a problem of time consumption. At the time of Dawn of Sorrow's release, Igarashi was also working on a home console title, which the series' artist, you know nearly all the gothic artwork from, Ayami Kojima was drawing for. This made her unable to also draw for Dawn of Sorrow, sadly. The one last thing I have to criticize a bit is the soundtrack. While having many memorable tracks, the soundtrack as a whole doesn't feel as unique and diverse as the other DS titles in Symphony of the Night, but it's still a joy to listen to and of good quality. If it wasn't for the awful gimmicks, the game could have maybe even been the best of all Metroidvanias in the series, but it's one of the best nonetheless. I already did this with number 8's Bloodstained, but place 4 does also go to a game that is technically not an original Castlevania game. But for the game I'm talking about, called Timespinner, it's a bit different why I put it on the list, even though its setting, story and producer is completely different to the Castlevania games. While this was the case for Bloodstained, which was the reason it appeared on the list, for Timespinner it's the fact that it truly feels like one of the Igarashi games in gameplay style, music and most importantly quality. Its visuals are pixel art that heavily draw from games like Symphony of the Night and the DS games. Some environments and enemies even look like they could have been straight out of one of these games, from the art style and the enemy behavior, that makes you think that you actually are playing a Castlevania game. But the gameplay feels exactly like the other Igavanias as well, while being a bit faster like Order of Ecclesia. The map design and style, quest items, abilities, physics and the overall feel of the game truly manages to replicate the Igavanias, even with a whole different setting, which is the one thing Bloodstained couldn't do in my opinion. Talking about story, while being very different to what Castlevania offers, it's for the better here, since it actually is very interesting and intriguing. You take on the role of Lunais, a timekeeper who, after her timeline was invaded by an intergalactic empire, travels through time to prevent the annihilation of her village. Thus, the game takes place in a future and a past timeline, with the past resembling Castlevania's setting, with a sci-fi touch, and the future feeling a lot like Metroid. Many logs and letters can be found in the game world that explain the backstory of Timespinner's world, or rather worlds, and offer some nice surprises. But I highly advise to read them because they give you information you need when you have to make decisions that actually really affect the ending of the story. The aforementioned split world offers a more interesting take on the mirrored castle concept from Harmony of Dissonance and Symphony of the Night, but it could have used a bit more gimmicks of the past affecting the future. The soundtrack is great by incorporating gothic PlayStation 1 inspired tracks that sound exactly like the Castlevania games, and some futuristic sounding ones with a mix of catchy tunes and atmospheric ones. The weapon system is a mixture between Aria of Sorrow and Order of Ecclesia, and Lunais can even have a variety of permanent familiars like Alucard and Symphony of the Night. True 100% completion is more manageable than in any of the other Igavanias, since there are a bit fewer enemy types and items and everything is being recorded in a checklist. Side quests are also a big part of the game and very similar to all of Ecclesia's by offering insight in the NPC's characters, emotions and relation. The characters are written well, very distinguished and give some insight in many different sexual orientations and relationship concepts. The only real downside the game has are that even for an Igavania-like game, it's pretty short. Other than that, the game lacks a bit of originality in the ability department, with often only having the standard things like double jumping outside of the game's main time stability. Talking about that, while being an interesting mechanic, it's in my opinion underused for platforming and makes boss battles way too easy. But other than that, Timespinner truly manages to give the player the feeling like he would play one of Igarashi's Castlevanias. So, if you actually never heard of this game and you played through every Igavania looking for anything similar, you should most definitely play this game. Starting off the top 3 is Portrait of Ruin, the second release DS Castlevania. This time we take control of two characters, with Jonathan Morris and Charlotte Orlean, in a game following the story of Castlevania Bloodlines. While the pair explores Dracula's castle again, half of the game is spent in the name-giving paintings in which different worlds are manifested. While this leads again to a not completely connected castle map, the paintings offer locations never really seen before in the Castlevania games, like a pyramid in a desert, London city streets or a magician's school. The gameplay in its core is classic Igavania stuff, but the dual character mechanic offers a different way of playing. Jonathan focuses on weapons and sub-weapons, while Charlotte supports him with magic abilities. You can play as one character and have the other assist you, as long as you have enough mana, that is, which offers the opportunity for very different strategies and boss fights. Furthermore, the game uses the two characters to implement very unique abilities for exploration, like jumping on your partner's shoulders, which no other game on the list has. What's a real treat is the fact that Portrait of Ruin has no touch gimmicks while being the follow-up to Dawn of Sorrow. While the game reuses quite a lot of enemies from its predecessor and even bosses in its challenge area, its new bosses are great and very unique. I mean, no other game in the series has a fight against both Death and Dracula as a menacing pair at the same time. Portrait of Ruin may also offer the biggest endgame content, with the before mentioned challenge area Nest of Evil, and 3 whole different alternate modes with Richter mode, Sister mode starring the game's antagonists Stella and Loretta, and the awkward Old Axe Armor mode that you only unlock by killing an unbelievably high amount of Old Axe Armor enemies. But the game unfortunately has some shortcomings as well. The last 4 paintings are practically reskins of the first 4, and thus feel a bit like padding. The side quests in the game are pretty boring and shallow, and some of them can become uncompletable if you sell required items, for example. And since you can cancel quests, this can lock you out of getting new quests if you mess up 5 quests at a time. In addition, the original version of PRR had a ton of bugs, some even game breaking, but fortunately for the European release they got patched. Other than that, general level design lacks a bit in some areas don't offer any reason to backtrack and places to use new abilities. And secret items are far more rare than in any other Igavania. Secret rooms in general are far more rare in this game. Some portraits even have none at all, making exploration somehow monotonous. But the level design and form of enemy placement, platforming, the level art style and the music make up for that completely in my opinion. Lastly, the anime art style is returning for this game and it looks as awful as Dawn of Sorrows. For this game it's particularly unfitting considering its World War II setting and the serious tone. But Portrait of Ruin is one of the best Metroidvanias due to its uniqueness. After I highly praised Igarashi's Castlevania games for quite some time now, and them being one of my favorite games of all time, my second place may surprise or even shock you, because it goes to Lords of Shadow Mirror of Fate. While I said that the 3D Lords of Shadow's entries won't appear on the list because they are too different to the rest of the list, this somehow doesn't go for Mirror of Fate. While the game is made by Mercury's team, who fittingly worked on Metroid 5, or better known as Metroid Dread recently, it incorporates a lot of Lords of Shadow staples like the Assassin's Creed-like climbing, the hack and slash combat, and quick-time events. In its core, it's still a 2D Metroidvania set in an interconnected version of Dracula's castle. Story-wise, it is part of the Lords of Shadow reboot's canon, but we this time play as 3 familiar faces in form of Simon Belmont, Trevor Belmont, and Alucard. This combination works surprisingly great and offers a fusion of the best of both Metroidvanias and Lords of Shadow games. The combat feels really fluid and satisfying, and movement is very fast. Exploration is supported by the great platforming and movement abilities like whip swimming and wall jumping. In addition, all 3 characters, while playing similar, offer their own movement and combat abilities that distinguish them nicely. Also, they all 3 explore different parts of the castle for the most part, which keeps every playthrough fresh. Talking about the castle, for an original 3DS game, the locations are beautiful and very detailed, and truly haunting and sometimes even creepy. That intriguing and captivating atmosphere is highly supported by Mirror of Fate's beautiful music. While being composed by the same composer as the other Lords of Shadow games, this time every area has its own theme like the Igavanias. While they are much more atmospheric rather than catchy, they have memorable melodies in comparison to Lords of Shadow's more ambient compositions. Every track was sticking in my mind after I played the game for the first time, and tracks like Carousel became one of my favorites ever. What's also very different to the Igavania games is the incorporation of cutscenes and voice acting, which supports the story very well. Talking about it, the game does something I would like to see in many more games, with multiple playable characters. In the playthroughs you will encounter situations and scenes you can later learn the reason for from a different perspective by playing a different character, which offers some really cool moments and surprises. Mirror of Fate's more cinematic approach also really shows in the boss fights, which are just epic and still very challenging. The only downside of boss battles were the quick-time events in the 3DS original, but with the game's release on consoles they fortunately took them out of the battles. The 3 characters' abilities are very unique and can be used in cool ways, even in backtracking, which the game offers quite a lot of. There are many secrets to be found, even if they are mostly only health or ammo upgrades or diaries to read. But that makes sense since the game, unlike the Igavanias, has no major RPG elements in form of different weapons or equipment. It still has a level system, but that is very straight-lined and only unlocks different hack and slay combos for the whip with each level. While the 3 stories work really well and offer a lot of diversity, that means that the game has again no huge connected castle, but 3 different ones, which some Metroidvania fans may not like again. And while the story is very interesting, the fact that it's part of the Lords of Shadow canon, which was discontinued after the second game, makes its impact pretty much irrelevant, sadly. But Mirror of Fate is still one of my favorite games because of its clean gameplay, variety in locations, great exploration, platforming and combat, as well as the beautiful music. While being quite different to any game of the rest of the list, I highly advise any Metroidvania or Castlevania fan to try this game out, even if it has the Lords of Shadow name in it. Now we finally come to my number 1, my first and still favorite Castlevania game of all time. Castlevania Order of Ecclesia. This entry is the last Castlevania game Igarashi worked on and thus the last Igavania released. It's the third game on the DS of the series, which truly shows in its quality. We take on the role of Shanoa, a member of the Church of Ecclesia, a group of people who invented a method to stop Dracula's resurrection even without the vampire killer, which was necessary after Richter Balmont vanished as the last member of his clan. The aforementioned method are the glyphs, magical seals Shanoa can absorb and use as weapons or magical abilities. After she was chosen as the one to defeat Dracula by her mentor Barlow rather than her friend Albus, he vanished, trying to obtain the Dominus glyph, which is needed to defeat the Dark Lord, freezing innocent villagers from the village Vigor on his way for his research. Shanoa is then tasked to follow his lead. In my opinion, this is a very unique story that truly differs from the usual pretty simple Castlevania plots for once. But Order of Ecclesia, at least in art style, finally returns to its gothic roots with beautiful artwork and character design. The whole game in general can be considered the best looking Igavania, with its lively and colorful locations, beautiful sprites and enemy design, which are for the most part unique to this game, unlike the other Igavanias, which reuse many sprites and models. The whole style and feel of the game is very atmospheric, even for a DS game, and much darker than Order of Ecclesia's predecessors. This is also supported by the, in my opinion, best Castlevania soundtrack. While offering some catchy tunes like An Empty Tome, Order of Ecclesia has many very dark songs that convey a certain atmosphere. The sound quality is imaginably high for a DS game, and the tracks often bring a very epic and adventurous tone with them, to really make the player feel like the task is actually important and stakes are high. And they definitely are. Order of Ecclesia is maybe the most challenging Igavania, but in a fair way. Sometimes even classic Castlevania hard, but that actually makes parts much more satisfying to platform and battle through. Speaking of combat, Shanoa might have the best and fastest combat of the series. By deciding to not divide combat into magic and weapon, but assigning 2 slots for glyphs of any kind which can be used very fast, combat feels more fluid than ever before. This system is supported by Dawn of Sorrow's returning mechanic of 3 different glyph sets that you can switch to on the fly. Order of Ecclesia for the first time has an overworld map, on which you can enter a high amount of different locations time after time, which is similar to PRR's painting level design. While this leads again to an uninterconnected level design for the whole game itself, this system allows for locations like oceans, mountains, haunted houses or churches to appear, which we would never see inside of Dracula's castle, which is great. While there are levels that are just straight lines that only offer combat instead of exploration or platforming, most levels are quite large and have a fair share of secrets to uncover. And with another rendition of Dracula's castle as one big level, as big as Portrait of Ruins Castle, we also get an interconnected place to fully explore as well. One other thing Order of Ecclesia has that none other Igavania had before to this extent is a hub world in form of the before mentioned village Vigor. After rescuing them, the village is filled with multiple people, who offer Shanoa quite interesting side quests for a 2D platformer. This does not only give more reason to backtrack and explore, but also deepens the villager's character, and adds highly to the setting, story and immersion. Thus, character development for the main characters in form of Shanoa, Albus and Barlow, but also for the other NPCs is much higher and better than ever before, and the game has much more dialogue in general. All in all, Order of Ecclesia is one of the best Castlevanias, and maybe the most refined, best sounding, most atmospheric, and most fun 2D Metroidvania Castlevania. A must play for every fan. This was my ranking list for all the 2D Metroidvania Castlevanias, or also called Igavanias, with some additions, obviously. Let me know your ranking and what you think of my list in the comments down below, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe. That would really help my still very small and quite new channel. Thanks for watching, sayonara.